For generations, the people of Judah believed their capital, Jerusalem, was invincible.
After all, the majestic Temple of Solomon stood at its heart, the very dwelling place of God's presence on earth.
But the prophet Jeremiah walked the streets with a terrifying message. The Babylonians were coming, and God would not stop them.
He warned that their idolatry and injustice had broken the covenant, making the impending destruction a divine judgment.
The kings and priests scoffed, throwing Jeremiah into a muddy cistern to silence his treasonous panic.
But as the dust clouds of King Nebuchadnezzar's massive army appeared on the horizon, the laughter abruptly stopped. In 589 BC, the Babylonian war machine encircled Jerusalem, cutting off all food and water. For 18 agonizing months, the siege held, starving the population until the horrors within the walls defied description. Finally, the unbreachable walls of Jerusalem were breached, and Babylonian soldiers poured into the holy city. They slaughtered the defenders, captured the fleeing king Zedekiah, and forced him to watch his sons die before blinding him. Then they turned their attention to the crown jewel of the city, Solomon's temple. The sacred sanctuary, untouched for 400 years, was stripped of its gold, defiled, and set ablaze.
With their city in ashes and their temple destroyed, the surviving elites, priests, and artisans were bound in chains. They were forced to march hundreds of miles across the brutal, scorching Syrian desert toward the heart of the Babylonian Empire. It was a death march that stripped away everything that defined their identity: their land, their king, and their sanctuary.
They wondered if their god had been defeated by the Babylonian deity, Marduk, or if he had simply abandoned them forever.
Arriving in Babylon, they were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the greatest metropolis the ancient world had ever seen. Here in the shadow of the towering ziggurats, the exiles wept as they remembered Zion.
Without a temple, the ancient sacrificial system that had defined their faith abruptly ceased.
If they could not sacrifice animals to atone for sins, how could they possibly remain in a covenant with God?
In this profound crisis, the exiled priests and scribes made a revolutionary shift that would change religion forever.
They turned away from the physical altar of blood and turned toward the written word of the Torah. Gathering in small homes, they began to study the scriptures, pray collectively, and sing the Psalms. This was the birth of the synagogue, a portable, text-based faith that could survive anywhere in the world.
While the masses lived in settlements along the rivers, a few brilliant Jewish youths were taken into the royal court.
Among them was Daniel, who navigated the dangerous politics of Babylon while refusing to compromise his faith. When the king had a terrifying dream that his own sorcerers could not decipher, Daniel stepped forward.
He interpreted the vision of a massive statue, predicting the rise and fall of empires, proving his God was sovereign over all nations.
Daniel's presence in the highest echelons of power demonstrated that God's influence was not confined to the borders of Israel.
Even in the deepest exile, the God of Israel was pulling the strings of history.
Out in the rural refugee settlements, the priest Ezekiel experienced some of the most mind-bending visions in biblical history.
He saw the very glory of God, a terrifying mechanical chariot of wheels within wheels, carried by angelic beings.
This vision carried a profound message. God had not been defeated. He had packed up his throne and followed them into exile. Later, God brought Ezekiel to a desolate valley filled with dry, bleached human bones. As Ezekiel prophesied, the bones rattled, attached to one another, and were covered in flesh and breath. It was a promise of national resurrection, that despite their utter destruction, God would breathe life back into his people. Surrounded by Babylonian myths and creation stories, the Jewish scholars realized they needed to preserve their own history. It was during this intense period of exile that much of the Old Testament was compiled, edited, and finalized. They wove together the ancient traditions of Genesis and Exodus to remind themselves of who they were.
They finalized the books of Kings to explain exactly why the exile happened, not because God failed, but because they had sinned. The Torah became their portable homeland, a sanctuary made of words that no army could ever burn down.
In losing their physical kingdom, they gained the permanent, unshakable foundation of the Holy Bible.
For 70 years, the Jewish people lived in exile, building homes, planting gardens, and waiting.
But the prophecies of Jeremiah were ticking down. Babylon's time as the ruler of the world was expiring.
To the east, a new superpower was rising, the Persian Empire, led by a brilliant and tolerant king named Cyrus the Great.
In 539 BC, the Persians diverted the Euphrates River and marched right under the impenetrable walls of Babylon in the dead of night.
The great Babylonian Empire fell almost without a fight, collapsing exactly as the prophets had foretold. For the Jewish exiles, the unimaginable was happening. Their captors had just been conquered. Unlike the brutal Babylonians who deported conquered peoples, Cyrus the Great had a completely different strategy. He believed that allowing captive nations to return home and worship their own gods would create a loyal, stable empire. In his very first year, Cyrus issued an astonishing decree that echoed throughout the empire. He formally permitted the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem and commanded them to rebuild the temple of their God. The prophet Isaiah had actually named Cyrus decades earlier, calling this pagan king God's anointed shepherd. The 70 years of captivity were officially over. The great return was about to begin. However, returning to a ruined wasteland was a daunting prospect. Many Jews chose to stay in the comfort of Babylon. But a dedicated remnant of nearly 50,000 people packed their belongings and faced the grueling journey back. They carried with them the salvaged gold and silver vessels that the Babylonians had looted from Solomon's temple decades ago. Led by Zerubbabel, a descendant of King David, they finally crested the hills and looked down upon their homeland. What they saw was not a glorious kingdom, but a burnt, overgrown landscape of ruins and rubble. The physical reality was devastating, but they had brought the Torah, and they were ready to rebuild. The first order of business was to clear the rubble and rebuild the altar of God amidst the ruins. When the foundation of the second temple was finally laid, the priests blew trumpets, and the people shouted with a great shout of joy. But the older men, who still remembered the unparalleled glory of Solomon's original temple, wept with a loud voice.
The new structure was small, modest, and lacked the breathtaking gold and grandeur of the past. Even worse, the Ark of the Covenant was missing, lost to history during the Babylonian destruction.
Yet the prophets Haggai and Zechariah encouraged them, promising that the glory of this latter house would one day surpass the former. Years later, Ezra the scribe and Nehemiah the cupbearer arrived to rebuild the city walls and teach the Torah to the people. They established a community strictly dedicated to the written word, ensuring the horrors of the exile would never be repeated. The Babylonian exile had completely transformed them. They went into captivity as Israelites, but they returned as Jews. The synagogue system, the finalized Hebrew Bible, and the fierce dedication to the law were all forged in the fires of Babylon. This was the exact religious landscape that Jesus of Nazareth would walk into 500 years later. The exile proved that God's kingdom was not tied to a building or a city, but lived within the hearts of his people, wherever they roamed.